Hello and welcome to the IHS Markit Trade Risk and Compliance webinar. Today's webinar will begin with prepared remarks followed by a live Q&A after. You'll notice a variety of tools and resource materials available on the webinar console and the toolbar, like speaker bios and a short survey. Please take a moment to fill out the survey before the conclusion of the webinar, as that information is extremely valuable to us. Also available on your toolbar is a help icon if you need some assistance to help connecting to the webinar itself. All attendees are in a listen-only mode, so if you have a question for the panel, please submit them at any time using the Q&A widget. This webcast will be available on demand shortly after the event ends and can be accessed using the same link you used here today. We would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone into the broadcast. We're so glad to have you all in attendance for today's important and topical discussion regarding trade risk and compliance. Today's focus will be centered around the related topics of tariffs, export controls, and more in the context of the upcoming effective date of January 1, 2022 for the scheduled harmonized schedule revisions. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. My name is Mike Wyman, and it's my pleasure to be moderating today's discussion. I've spent the last 8 years at IHS Markit in a variety of roles, currently serving as Associate Director of Industry Solutions in our pre-sales team of solution specialists within our Maritime and Trade Division. I'm based in Denver, Colorado, USA. I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues, both also within IHS Markit, Maritime and Trade, and both industry thought leaders in this arena, Russell Patterson and Byron McKinney. And we are also honored to be joined by Alexander Malakat of Opus Advisory for today's conversation. Gentlemen, welcome. Would you care to introduce yourselves at this time? Maybe we can start with Russell and continue in the order of your images on this slide.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, my name is Russell Patterson. I work as part of the Industry Solutions team that Mike oversees. Been with IHS Markit about 7 years at this point. Have been in the international trade arena for about, I guess we're going on 27 years this year. My area of expertise is just import and export data and trade statistics specifically, and have worked in a number of areas and a number of roles in that area, and really looking forward to having this conversation.
Thanks, Russell. My name is Byron McKinney. I'm the product manager within the risk and compliance team at IHS Markit, based in London in the United Kingdom. My focus as a company is within trade compliance and compliance across the supply chain as well. Particular focus on shipping, dual-use goods, container bill of lading verification, and also price evaluation, misinvoicing, etc. Pass on to Alexander.
Thank you, Byron, and thank you to IHS Markit and gentlemen to you for inviting me to join today. My name is Alexander Malakat. I'm based in Toronto, Canada, and I've been in various primarily advisory roles around international trade, trade financing and risk, and then trade-related international development, as well as the compliance-related activities and industry advocacy, and then more recently, ESG and sustainability as it relates to trade, perhaps inevitably. So very much looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. And I was really excited to see the diversity of backgrounds and specialties for the panelists that we have lined up for today's session, which should really contribute to an especially robust and thorough discussion on these topics. So, so welcome to you all. And I'm really excited to get underway. So Russell, I think maybe it makes sense to start with a general discussion around the harmonized system itself. Maybe we can start off just by you giving us a quick overview of the system, how it's employed by market participants, and I think that might set the stage for a transition into a discussion about the revision exercises scheduled just around the corner in the new year.
Great, thanks, Mike. So just over the years in working with information and data, one of the great truths that has come to me is that with information, context is king. A fact by itself may be ultimately good and true, but it's only really when it's put into context with other information that it becomes, it becomes helpful and really actionable. For example, if I were to tell any of you that the vehicle that you're traveling in, only has 5 liters of fuel left in it, that's a good and true fact. But the real question is, in what context is that, are those 5 liters going to be used? Are you on a Vespa or are you in a cargo plane? The answer to that question ultimately tells you what your next 3 minutes are going to look like. So to that end, as we begin to look at the HS revisions that are coming up, we want to have a discussion around the HS system and the impact that it has in your life and business. And a good way to start that is to begin to set the stage by spending a few minutes discussing the harmonized system and how we came to have it and how it's structured. So the ultimate purpose for the official name is the Harmonized Commodity Description and Coding System. Hardly anybody ever calls it that. It's either a harmonized system, or we even shorten it to HS, is to have a universal economic language and code with which to identify goods. And for that reason, international trade, because it's universally used, international trade really doesn't work without the HS system. It's used as the basis for the customs tariffs of more than 200 countries and economies around the world. And it's over 5,000 different 6-digit HS codes covering different commodity groups, represent 98% of all international trade. Its origin comes from an effort to harmonize customs and trade procedures around the world, and ultimately make them quicker and cheaper to maintain. But it is leveraged now in a myriad of areas. From economic research and analysis to creating trade policies like free trade agreements, or to examine tariffs, the monitoring of controlled goods and the tracking of freight tariffs, the gathering of transport statistics, the monitoring of international the international stage of prices, the tracking of trade quotas, and even down to determining the countries of origins of goods.
Okay, so in a nutshell, Russell, you're basically just saying that when an international traded good crosses country borders, they're given this specific HS code, which is then aggregated for analysts to determine what types of goods are being imported or exported, and from there kind of compare to maybe current and historical publication periods to inform a variety of end goals. Is that approximately right?
Absolutely, Mike. You got it in one. Yeah, the harmonized system very much serves as the skeleton or the structure around which the movement of goods is framed. So in kind of talking about this, it might be good to step back and just look to see how the harmonized system is structured. So the harmonized system is broken down into 97 2-digit chapter codes from HS 01 to HS 97. Now, each chapter represents as a wide category of merchandise, with particular types of merchandise being grouped together into what are referred to as sections. So for instance, chapters 86 through 89 are grouped together in a section for vehicles. This covers railway vehicles in HS 86, non-railway vehicles, which are cars and scooters and bikes and those kind of things, under HS 87, aircraft and spacecraft under HS 88, and ships and boats under HS 89. Now, there are 3 others that I didn't mention, which are HS 00, 98, and 99. Those are not actually harmonized. Those are not actually part of the harmonized system, but they are used by individual governments to report trade for special codes, like suppression codes, or goods that are reported under special categories or schemes, like the movement of military goods or low-value shipments, things like that. Just completely trade data geek nerd stuff. One of the things I find fascinating about the harmonized system is the fact that the creators of it back in the late 80s, when they created it, they actually left HS 77 blank to be used for future technologies or future goods that had yet to be discovered. So they were forward thinking enough to realize that there was going to come a point in time. So they left an entire chapter open based upon something that might come in the future. Now, each of these chapters, these 2-digit chapters, are broken down into what are referred to as headings. And those headings they do this by adding 2 additional digits to the 2-digit code. And the number of headings varies according to the level of granularity that's needed according to the type of good. So for instance, HS 29 for organic chemicals has 42 different headings under it, whereas something like headgear, I've completely forgotten which one it is. But anyway, for headgear is actually broken down into only 7 different headings. So according to the need for the level of detail is according to how it's broken out in the HS system. Now, each of those headings is then broken down even further into what are referred to as HS codes. And these are 6-digit codes. And this is the lowest level of international standardization that's available. So if you look at a particular 6-digit code for one country and look at a particular 6-digit code for another, those codes are exactly the same and are looking at the same types of goods. So that's the lowest level of international standardization, but it's not the lowest level in which HS codes exist. Below that, each country or economic body is given the freedom to break down the trade into their own custom tariff schedule. This is done by adding additional digits, and it can be anywhere from an 8-digit code to a 13-digit code, according to the individual customs agency's decisions. These tariff line codes are not internationally standard, and they are broken down to best reflect the needs of the particular country.
Okay. Got it. So if I'm hearing you right, if I'm an analyst, for example, I might be wise to focus on that kind of 2, 4, or 6-digit level because that's what's universal across all the world's reporters. But if I'm looking for kind of the maximum granularity of commodity types, then I do have the option to go down to the tariff line level. But knowing that, let's say, a 10-digit tariff line code recognized by one country won't be recognized by another country at that level.
Exactly, Mike. And actually, you've raised a vital distinction when you're talking about HS codes. Two countries can actually choose to have their tariff line codes have the same number of digits, but how those countries or economic bodies choose to break them out can be completely different. With even two countries using the same code, but giving them slightly different definitions. To add to that level of complexity, some countries actually choose to have differing coding breakouts depending on whether the goods are being exported or imported. So for instance, Australia and Canada both use 8-digit codes to identify their exported goods, but use 10-digit codes when identifying imported ones. And to add even more of a complex twist to it, the United States uses 10 digits for exports and imports, but actually uses completely different schedules based upon whether it's an exported good or an imported good. So let's give you a kind of a real world working example of this, and let's use apples. Apples are, of the 97 two-digit chapters, fruits and nuts actually appear under HS08. So that's any kind of fruit or nut, that's where it's going to land. Under that, there are these headings, and of the headings, we actually have HS0808 is where apples land, along with pears and quinces. Again, this is fresh fruit. And then under that, we have HS080810, which is for apples. So at an international level, if you were looking for apples, you would go to 080810. But then when we go to a national level, we begin to see how this breakout can vary from country to country. So New Zealand, which is a large exporter of apples, breaks down into 10-digit codes, and they actually divide their that 6-digit HS code in their tariff line level according to the variety of apples. So it's a Braeburn or a Fuji apple, according to the type it is, and they actually have 13 different codes that they use in breaking down for apples. The United States also uses a 10-digit code, but their breakout is, instead of looking at varieties, is according to the pricing, whether or not it's 22 cents higher or lower than 22 cents per kilo, and also whether or not they're actually certified as organic. Mainland China, completely different story. They actually use an 8-digit code, and they don't actually care much about how it's broken out beyond that. It's because they actually have only one code for apples. So basically the same code that you would use for 080810, the 6-digit HS code, is basically the same at their detail level at the 8-digit code.
Thanks a lot, Russell. Yeah, and I think that summary was valuable, right? I mean, in my role, I find that I spend a lot of time, even with seasoned trade analysts, explaining the structure, with a lot of that discussion kind of just around the fundamental structure of the scheme, right? So yeah, thanks for that. You do it probably better than anyone. And Alexander, I'd like to just invite you into the conversation as early as possible here. As someone who's had an extensive career in the world of international trade, I'm curious how you would characterize the importance of the harmonized schedule to the various segments of global trade, from the level of international bodies and customs agencies to trade finance and supply chain logistics providers. Can you give us any insight into the complexity of how the use of the HS system is used to balance the needs of these various elements within the world of international trade?
Absolutely, Mike. Thank you. And actually, I've had a quick scan at our attendee list, and that speaks to, if you look at who's there, I mean, you've got bankers, you've got multilateral institutions, you've got public policy bodies. So the variety of audience members speaks to the breadth of relevance of the topic. So look, from my perspective, I can point to a couple of, let's say, bring it to life kind of examples, right? In one of the areas where we spend some time in trade finance, so just as Russell said, trade wouldn't take place without the IHS codes. I can also say that we've learned since 2008, and when I say we, the broader world, in a sense, beyond practitioners, have learned since 2008 that trade doesn't take place without some form of trade financing. So according to the WTO and others, 80% of merchandise trade flow today, which is about 20 trillion US a year, depends on some form of trade financing. And underneath that set of activity, you cover everything from very traditional established trade finance mechanisms like letters of credit that some people will know very well, to supply chain finance techniques that have been very much in the headlines of late for a variety of reasons. So all of that, anyway, to say that data is a critical component of the financing piece of things. And I'll say as much from a risk assessment and adjudication point of view as from a transactional structuring point of view. But to get from kind of the conceptual to the more practical, let me bring in the compliance conversation, right? So in international trade finance, one of the things that you look at is financial crimes compliance. You look at things like anti-money laundering, you look at things like anti-terrorism financing. And so the goods that are being shipped and transported are a vital component of that analysis. You can get into situations where certain goods are being allegedly shipped, and then there's over or under invoicing to hide money laundering activity. And so one of the pieces of work that we're doing where the IHS codes could become very relevant is to try to understand how potential financial crime is being reported. And so again, to get very granular about it, there are these things called suspicious activity reports or suspicious transaction reports that financial institutions, lawyers, accountants, and other players are meant to file from a regulatory perspective if they suspect something illicit is going on. And from a trade perspective, there's a tremendous opportunity to file very data and information rich SARs or STRs because of the documentation that comes along with a trade transaction. When you're dealing with a straight payment, there's very little beyond knowing where the payment is going sort of from and to and what the amount is and what the currency is. There isn't much else that you can say about the payment. In trade, you typically have 35 to 45 pages of documentation per trade finance transaction. And within that, a rich trove of data around the shipment, even the flagging of the vessel, the routing, any sort of transshipment points, and then details about the goods themselves. And so the IHS codes, we think, can be very relevantly added to the suspicious transaction reports or the SARs as an element of helping to identify, for example, a case of money laundering. So I'm doing some of this work for the last 3 years or longer with the Asian Development Bank, who was just cited in terms of, they've done the analysis on the trade finance gap and a number of other sort of industry shaping pieces of work around trade finance and trade. But this is one of those areas where data like the IHS code can be extremely relevant.
Yeah, very interesting, Alexander. Thanks for that insight. And we'll be leaning on you a little bit later as we get to dual use goods. So stay tuned. So I'm glad we spent a little bit of time setting this up because I think it may fill in some gaps for some attendees today, but also kind of pave the way for the pivot into our main topic today, which of course is the upcoming revision process, right? So, back to Russell, I'm excited to hear what you've prepared for us regarding the impetus for this revision. Which organization specifically oversees the revision efforts and what implications it has for stakeholders like those listening into the discussion today.
Great. So just kind of some background, the harmonized system is not a static system, and it's one that changes over time based on the needs of the trade community. A quick overview of the revision process may help in understanding what's gone into what we're going to see with the 2022 HS revisions. So revisions actually start as recommendations from customs and trade agencies of individual countries by industry groups or other interested parties as changes for the HS system. These are usually reviewed internally within the local government, being passed to customs agencies, finance ministries, commerce departments, and even potentially the agriculture department, depending upon what the commodities are. The considered changes may also be opened up and requests for public comments can be made. Once the government actually has a position on a request, and decide to move forward with it, they'll submit it to the World Customs Organization, which is the overseeing body for the harmonized system, and review particularly their review subcommittee, who then considers the request. It can be approved, or it can be held over for further review, and according to its complexity, can undergo multiple consultations with contracting parties or industry groups. Once a consensus is achieved about it, the change is drafted and it's sent to the Harmonized System Committee for final approval, which is a voting body, and it must receive a 2/3 majority to move forward. That change and additional changes, according to what they are then collected and at some point aggregated and submitted to the WCO Council for approval. And if approved, they are then enacted about 30 months later, giving local governments time to make the necessary changes to their local or the harmonized schedules that they're using, their tariff schedules. And hence, so the 2022 revision you're getting ready to see was actually finalized about mid-year 2019.
And I actually find that last point pretty fascinating, right? I mean, this isn't something that's finalized maybe, 6 months prior to the plan revision, but actually a full 2.5 years prior to the revision taking effect. So if I think about kind of the overall cadence, every 2.5 years, the WCO is either finalizing the revision or enacting the revision.
There's a lot of additional operations that have to take place on both a national and international level when a revision takes place, and that the WCO tries to provide a good amount of time for those to be accomplished. And this, is from, like as the customs agencies of each country or economic region having to make adjustments to their individual tariff schedules, publication of documentation in a variety of languages, to changes in standing trade agreements to reflect the new update. An HS revision is a major event and requires years to enact. So what actually happens during an HS revision? And really, basically everything can be broken down into 3 parts. We're going to either the addition of an HS code, the discontinuation or deletion of an HS code, or the change of scope of an existing HS code. And some combination of these are used within the revision, and the complexity of these changes could span from fairly straightforward to very complicated. So the addition of an HS code with the introduction of a new 4 or 6-digit code happened for a variety of reasons. And one of the most common is when a general code is broken down to provide greater granularity into the products that are being traded by providing specific HS codes for goods that used to be reported together. Another potential reason for an addition of HS codes is when it's decided that the structure of how a particular good is reported is reinterpreted within the harmonized system. So if the trade for a particular type of technology, maybe a new technology, has been scattered across multiple HS codes, and it's decided that the trade should be restructured to have the trade of that good consolidated in its own set of codes, as is happening in 2022 with 3D printers and unmanned drones, then new codes will be created to allow for the reporting of the goods after this restructuring. Now, on the deletion side, that's another potential change that can happen where a formerly used HS code is no longer employed in the system. And one of the potential reasons for this is that the volume of trade being reported for a particular code is no longer large enough to warrant it having its own HS code. We were actually having a discussion earlier that fax machine code is actually has been discontinued. You see this, throughout the HS system, and basically when that happens, the goods are then rolled into an existing code, or a new code is created to consolidate the trade of the discontinued code with other commodities of the same type. Additionally, HS codes can be discontinued again with the restructuring of the harmonized system. So for instance, when a more general code is then broken down into greater detail by having new codes added, that general code would be discontinued because the trade that it previously represented would be reported under new codes. The final type of change of the revision is the change in scope of an existing HS code. And this can happen both on the addition and deletion of a code, where a portion of the trade reported in a code is shifted to a new code, or the deletion of a lesser used code means that the scope of trade of an existing code changes after the revision. These changes are often some of the most hard to track as the description of the affected code may not change at all.
Mm. I find these three categories, Russell, very interesting through the lens of technological innovations. You know, in my role in analyzing trade data and helping other users to do the same, I find that we're usually looking at kind of the top traded commodities and how those flows are shifting from period to period, whether that be, you know, kind of those micro monthly shifts or more significant shifts annually. But for that deletion exercise, it's almost like the inverse, where we're looking at the lowest traded goods commodities. And at some point, the technology has reached the end of its useful life, and there's little meaningful trade to the point of deleting the code. But also in the area of additions, if I think back to the amount of new technology hitting the market since the last revision in 2017, you know, this current structure, right, runs all the way through 2021, and it was actually finalized in, you know, mid 2014, so quite a long time to account for new technologies being developed and having to be accounted for in international trade.
Absolutely right, Mike. This is one of those moments where just kind of the long tail of this is something you have to watch for an extended period of time. And you know, technology is a great place to see this play out in the HS system. You know, the HS system actually was introduced in like the late 80s. And just think for a moment about the different types of writable media that's used for computers that we've had since the introduction of the Harmonized system. We've gone from floppy disks to like optical media like CDs and DVDs to flash drives. And all the time, the Harmonized system has had to keep up with these innovations by introducing new codes or reorganizing codes. And so it's been especially for analysts who are trying to track those kind of things, it can be a real challenge to kind of keep an eye on kind of where things are being reported as these revisions and as technology changes. So as we get started into actually talking about the 2022 revisions, and I realize this is kind of deep into this to just start talking about this, I want to alert the attendees of some resources that are produced by the World Customs Organization on their website, www.wcomd.org. There you're actually going to find the new 2022 Harmonized System Nomenclature by chapter, as well as a correlation between the affected codes from 2017 and the new codes for 2022 to help you evaluate if the upcoming changes to the HS system are going to affect you and your business. So definitely suggest that you guys take advantage of that. So let's look at some of the actual kind of changes that are taking place. Again, this is just a kind of broad overview. We're not going to go into all of them. But one of the things I wanted to start with as we begin looking at this is like mushrooms. Mushrooms up to through 2017 are being reported under two different HS codes, 070951 and 070959. 070951 being for a particular agaricus, which is effectively the little white button mushrooms you find in the grocery store. And everything else was listed under 070959. So there was white button mushrooms and everything else. Starting in 2022, we're actually going to have breakouts for Boletus, Cantharellus, shiitake, shiitake, sorry about that, and truffles, as well as then having that other category continuing to exist. So this is a perfect example of a moment where an HS code that has existed before, 070959, is actually going to change its scope because of all these new codes being introduced, breaking out and no longer being reported under that HS code. Additionally, we also have olive oil is seeing something new. We're deleting an HS code. 05 used to be that olive oil at 2017 was reported as virgin and other. And we're actually eliminating 150910, which was virgin olive oil, and replacing it with 150920, 30, and 40. So 20 will be for extra virgin, 30 will be for virgin olive oil, and then other olive oils will be under 40, with the other non-virgin oils continuing to be reported under 90. This is one of those perfect moments of realizing of seeing where the deletion of a code and the introduction of new codes happens simultaneously with an old code disappearing. Now, what's important to realize is that if you're tracking virgin olive oil and looking at this, where you were looking at for it before is actually going to stop being reported and will be reported under different areas in the statistics. Additionally, one of the other places where the scope of goods can change is in the notes. In the harmonized system, there's not only just the description of the HS codes themselves, but at the beginning of each chapter, there are notes. And this is the notes under HS02, which is for for meat. And this year, they're actually introducing a new code, 0410, which is for edible non-living insects. That the goods, or those goods, used to be being reported under HS02, but is now being moved to a completely different chapter. So to cover the fact that this chapter no longer covers edible non-living insects, they've actually added it as a note. So you can see that here the chapter does not cover, and it gives a list of things. So as you're looking at trade data, really do suggest that you go read the notes, because in this case, we're going to actually see the shift in trade, and the descriptions of the HS codes will not change at all under 02 to say, oh, well, it also doesn't include non-living insects. So a code like 020890 that used to have the trade for this type of good, will the description itself will never change, but the scope of the HS code has changed. Additionally, when we were talking about new technologies earlier, with each revision of the harmonized schedule, changes are given to make clearer kind of how that trade goes. And in this case, the 2022 revision is no exception, with a number of high-profile new technologies being highlighted by the adjustment of the HS schema. One example of the codes is for additive manufacturing, otherwise known as 3D printers. These used to be reported under a number of different HS codes, and here we can actually see that some of the new codes that are being created, which are the ones to the right of the two columns, are actually incorporating not just one other HS code, but in some cases 2, 3, and even 4 HS codes are being adjusted or to actually tease that information out and begin to report additive machineries under their own HS codes. Additionally, we're seeing the same thing for unmanned drones. Used to be that unmanned drones were actually reported under aircraft, according to the type of helicopter it was, under a particular weight, or oddly enough, if it had a camera on it, it would also be traded under an HS code for cameras. Now all of those are being broken out into HS 8809 for unmanned aircraft, and then you can see the listing of particular descriptions under each of those. So again, these are the kind of changes that we're seeing under the harmonized system revision for 2022, just around new technologies, around the adjustment and clarification of goods, and giving more information around what each of them does. Now, the revisions that happen, one of the overarching drivers in the revisions of the harmonized system is the supporting of international initiatives and efforts which touch upon the movement of goods through international trade. So back in '89, the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Waste and Their Disposal was adopted. In an effort to track commodities that are considered hazardous waste, particularly around electronic waste, like rare earth metals, the HS 2022 harmonized system revision is actually going to see the addition of code breakouts for hafnium and rhenium in an effort to aid in the enforcement of policies and the oversight of the Basel Convention. Another example of this is around the Kilgauli Amendment for the Montreal Protocols. In 2016, this amendment came down in which it helps kind of track the movement of ozone depleting chemicals as a supporting measure for this. The amendment saw nations agree to an 80% reduction of consumption and production of HFCs in the next 30 years. And the revision actually introduces an entirely new 4-digit code to help track those chemicals. Beyond that, the 2022 revision will see the support not only in environmental efforts, but also in efforts for international agencies trying to regulate and enforce the control of trade of controlled substances. To this end, a number of HS codes have been added to the revision around narcotics monitored under the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, including fentanyl and some of the precursor chemicals.
Great. Thanks, Russell. And maybe to lean back to Alexander, when we think about applicability of the HS schema to the finance arena, are there specific applications or implications to that industry?
Yeah, increasingly, Mike. I mean, one of the things that we've been doing over the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years in particular, is shifting our view of trade from being a bilateral business involving an importer and exporter under traditional mechanisms to looking at it as a supply chain, which makes us look at it as an ecosystem. And so under that broader context, the HS codes and the granularity of data and insight that that enables is increasingly relevant for us. So not only from a financing and credit education perspective, as I mentioned earlier, or from a financial crimes compliance, as we talked about earlier as well, but if if I pick up on Russell's point about the environmental impacts, right? In the context of ESG and sustainability, where we're thinking more and more about using finance as a mechanism for driving sustainable behavior, one of the elements that becomes critical is supply chain traceability. So can we track an item, a good, a product at very granular levels using an HS code and using additional data across a supply chain from start to finish to say, this is the same product, it was sourced sustainably, it traveled through the supply chain and hasn't in the meantime been replaced by another product, but actually got to the end point, and therefore we know that that sustainable behavior has gone, from start to finish. Can we apply finance to reward sustainable sourcing and traceable management of the product running across the supply chain? So certainly those are three areas where it's extremely relevant. So the finance, the risk assessment piece, the financial crimes compliance piece, and then again now the ESG or sustainability related traceability element of it. So you can very quickly appreciate how an HS code with the dynamic evolutions that Russell has kindly described for us becomes extremely relevant for people who are doing the kind of assessment that credit people do and that finance people do and that people involved in sustainable finance increasingly now are looking to do. So there's some very, very substantive and direct points of relevance between getting to granular data and getting to trusted data. And I mean, I heard, Russell, your point about nomenclature and definitions and all those sorts of things. Also elements that we think about in emerging finance practices like supply chain finance, where we started with nomenclature, are looking at definitions, and then are looking at driving uptake. Now, the advantage that HS codes have, of course, they're very familiar and they're, as was pointed out, very critical to the conduct of trade anyway. So there's an inherent motivation to use them and apply them more and more. And we're seeing that, as I mentioned, in our financial crimes compliance work. One of the elements that we are proposing is to look at things like HS codes to advance suspicious transaction reporting as a part of the compliance framework.
Very interesting. Wow. Yeah. Thanks for that synopsis there. And I think we're steadily progressing into an especially sensitive area now, known as dual use goods, right? So as we're a little bit past the halfway mark, Byron, as we pass the floor to you, perhaps you could give us just a little insight into what we're referring to when we say dual use goods, and how do these revisions account for those types of goods in international trade?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for the handover there. So yeah, dual-use goods is kind of a new topic really when it comes to the HS code system. As you can see on the slide here, there are 16 items now which are being included within the HS 2022 amendments, applying completely into strategic dual-use goods, covering various different types of materials, manufacturing, testing equipment, and also kind of complete key end-use products there as well. So the amendments either add or change existing HS codes in a way in which it separates out dual-use items from the original and the existing HS codes as well, to try and make things clearer, but also to try and align the HS code system with what is called the Eccn Nomenclature. So Eccn is the Export Control Classification Number, which are the numbers which are applied to dual-use and strategic goods lists, which are managed by, for example, the US Commerce Control List, or maybe the EU dual-use goods list as well. So those numbers are generally codes like 1A001, which covers nuclear goods, 2B001, which will cover things like ball bearings, and other things as well. So the items which you can see on the screen today are those categories which are either amended, which are the ones in black on the bullet points, and then the new ones which are in green. And the new ones might be something which has been, either amended or added to or created a new 6-digit code from as well. So these items here are now included in HS 2022, which adds a new opportunity for countries and states to be able to monitor and test the relative importance of a closer correlation between the HS system and the ECCNs regarding dual-use goods. So using the historical transaction and licensing data, what custom authorities are trying to do now is trying to identify relevant entities and provide information around the accurate HS identification under these new codes. So it's in the interest of custom state authorities to make these efforts and to ensure that the accurate HS identification is, or the more accurate the HS identification is, the easier it will be then to identify any potential export control violations and any instances of illicit trade within the global supply chain. So this particular kind of success will then help countries and states and the customs authorities within each of them to make a better case then for further amendments to strategic goods in the next 5-year iteration of the HS code scheme as well. And we're likely to see, more than 16 in that kind of version as well. We're likely to see a lot more spinning out of the dual-use goods items within the HS code schema.
Okay, so these are goods for which there's obviously a sizable international trade, and obviously you need to be able to track them from origins to end destinations as precisely as possible. And you give some good high-level examples here, but maybe it'd be helpful to do kind of a deep dive into a specific area and how the revisions aim to account for this type of trade, Byron.
Yeah, sure. So just on the next 2 slides really are just kind of a couple of examples really to kind of pull out where those particular differences are and where the changes have been made as well. So the one thing to note is, Russell and Alexander have already mentioned, the key feature around the HS system is, the ability to kind of systematically move between the chapter on the HS schema down into headings and down into subheadings to find the appropriate code with which to, classify the particular item. So when you do that today, you don't necessarily need to kind of work out, what are the particular technical parameters of the item as well. When it comes to the dual-use control list and strategic trade controls, what you're doing there is you're kind of classifying an item based on, its potential proliferation risk, the practicality of the type of control as well. And you're not looking at, anything regarding import duties or anti-dumping rights, etc. So strategic goods on these lists have very distinctive characteristics due to their types of capability, the technical threshold that they might have, what is the tensile strength of a particular alloy, what is the impact of the item if it, hits a certain temperature, those kinds of information. So when we look at the detail on the slide here now, we can see in the case of the unmanned aircraft issue, which Russell pulled out a little earlier as well, we didn't really have an explicit code on the 2017 version, which allowed us to manage and control unmanned aircraft within a dual-use or military setting. On the 2022 version, it becomes a little different. So as we looked at with, Chapter 88, it covered certain types of aircraft, usually piloted, certain types of drones, flying toys, for example. But now we have the new categorization with its 6-digit code, which looks at different segments based on unmanned aircraft for remote controlled flight, and other characteristics based on their takeoff weight and certain thresholds and parameters around that as well. And then there's a clear correlation back to that export control classification number as well. So 9A012 within the dual-use good military list, has that mapping into unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, and certain types which are regulated on those control lists as well. So that's kind of one area where the alignment is changing. The second one is also an interesting one on the next slide, which covers items around freeze dryers and spray dryers. So these items themselves, in the previous version of the HS code system in 2017, was specifically around things like agricultural products, wood, paper items as well, and then the categorization code for other. What we see in the new version of 2022, which has a direct link back to the ECCN dual-use strategic trade lists, is this area of lyophilization apparatus. So freeze drying units and spray dryers, which are used for medical purposes, but also used within kind of semiconductor electrical manufacturing of items as well. So a clear, kind of pure, straightforward dual-use goods item here, which is now being, reclassified, has a new digit, and allows for it to be kind of, managed and mapped within its own code, and to be used within that one specific purpose as well. Most of these map into kind of a variety of ECCN numbers, but the key one where it's linked to now at the moment on the dual-use goods regulatory list is around 2B352, which covers it within a kind of a biological materials setting and process. So those are kind of the key areas which we see some changes to. The next piece here is just to kind of pull out where those changes on the ECCN categories are actually based as well. So as we mentioned previously, the low percentage of what are strategically controlled dual-use items in trade within transactions and how they're managed, which don't involve strategic goods, makes the detection of illicit trade quite difficult using the old version of the HS code schema. The HS codes included in these new amendments now provide us with greater alignment with the language within ECCNs, which allow the creation of a better ability to be able to target searches on relevant commodities than under the previous system. So the items we can see here where the new categories are impacted are mostly around that kind of category 1, category 2 area. And there's kind of an importance here really, because these are the areas which are more the underlying components which are used within kind of finished goods or finished materials, which can be dual use. So for example, within the special materials area, it looks at, kind of precursor chemicals. There are items in there which cover other pieces around ball bearings, certain types of metals, alloys as well. And then in the materials processing piece, that also then looks at those particular items in category 1, but how they're used to create finished goods. So that might be like, certain types of machinery with a certain number of access or contouring, laser guided precision cutters, for example. And these are the kind of key areas which the latest HS goods classifications are targeted to. There are 13 areas there which are impacted under 1 and 2. The other areas which are kind of slightly mentioned and have some impact are within the electronics, lasers, and aerospace industry as well. But there it's a little bit less. The key focus comes within category 1 and category 2 on the dual-use goods list. So taking these last few slides on the dual-use goods changes on the HS system, there are just two kind of further examples to take a look at, which are, why these changes are being made, why they're coming up now, and what will they actually be used for as well. What is it the customs authorities, the WCO, and other organizations will like to get from this data. So on the slide which we can see here, one of the key methodologies which will be used within customs authorities and by analysts of this data is around what is called trade flow matching or mirror statistics. So that's basically a method to try to detect illicit activity, tariff avoidance, and other kind of general trade trends using a practice which will compare trade statistics between two reporting countries, or we'll use the reported trade statistics from one country to fill the gaps in the lack of reporting from a trade partner. So using this data, you might be able to find issues or detect issues around under/over evaluation of goods in terms of price is one aspect or one area. Any misclassification of codes, smuggling, or just general fraud as well. So what we can see here on the slide is just an example as to how this particular type of data can be drawn out, where you have a clear separate area which covers dual-use goods within the HS code schema. So on the left-hand side is Chinese export data for veterinary medicines which have been exported to Vietnam. The data there is in relation to US dollars, so value trade. And then on the right-hand side, same product again, veterinary medicine vaccines from China to Vietnam. But instead, this is based on kind of total weight of the shipment as well, expressed in kilograms here. So what you can see here in terms of the mirror statistics, and which is what financial integrity units, customs authorities all use as data analysis tools, is you can kind of see the different areas of reporting between the two countries who are involved in that trade. So on the left-hand side, you can see, within August 21 to September 21, a slight difference in what is reported on the Chinese side to what is reported on the Vietnamese side. So that kind of discrepancy, that kind of issue can be kind of highlighted here. And while it doesn't necessarily kind of give you a silver bullet into the issue itself, it does allow you to kind of evaluate something which could then lead to kind of greater scrutiny of that particular issue itself. So those HS code changes, which are now related to the ECCN, gives you that opportunity and gives that opportunity to customs authorities as well. Wherever you see these discrepancies or this misreporting, could be something which could then lead to the customs analyst to research and investigating this in a lot more detail. So the final issue, and just on the final slide, is another area which customs authorities will now use the data around the ECCN classification on the HS 2022 version. So this one here is just based on kind of commodity profiling. So this is the second methodology which can be used alongside the mirror statistics. So this one goes on to a micro version rather than the previous macro one we looked at. So this one starts to look at transactions data. So if you can separate your dual-use ECCN items out, and in this case, we'll go back and look at the lyophilization apparatus as an example. We look at transactional data, which is a portion of US import-exports around the last 2 years. And we'll look at a particular brand name as well here. So Lycovac is a producer or manufacturer of this particular type of apparatus. So if we find instances of it within US shipping documents, we can then put together a profile for that particular brand or that particular commodity. So on the left-hand axis, you can see the value of the shipment. So in the first section here, you can see the first item towards the leftmost part of the chart, which gives us a total shipment value of $1.8 million. And then on the right-hand side axis, you can see the quantity or the total number of items within that shipment itself. So that $1.8 million value relates to, I think it looks like, around 16 or 17 items itself. So we can use that kind of data and we can try and work out, what is the potential benchmark for this type of item? What is the total value of goods? What is the unit price? What is the weight or measurement in which these goods are shipped? How are they shipped as well? And you can see at the bottom of the chart there, there are various elements in terms of shipping, whether it's by pieces, packages, cartons or crates, etc. But what the customs authority would like to potentially hone in on are the kind of items where you see potential spikes. So that one just at the middle where the dotted line is pointing to is where that spike appears. And that could be something to kind of, deeper dive into to find out what the issue there is. So that one there has a total shipment probably of around $750,000, but the number of items which were part of that shipment totaled 18, which kind of puts it out of kilter or out of sync with everything else within that particular 2-year view. So that kind of just wraps up, where we are with dual-use goods. I think it's generally a big and very important change which is made, even though small. Albeit it's only 16 items which are being covered, but I think we're likely to see a lot more targeted information and research within most of those areas. Those 16 items which the HS 2022 version brings out, I think we're likely to see a lot more activity in regards to not just enforcement action, but also research and investigation by customs authority on those areas as well.
Yeah, very interesting, Byron. Obviously, we're looking at some use cases here that are not just strictly academic import export, kind of quantity value unit price, but with the potential for a much wider application. And just a reminder to the audience, we have about 5 minutes left or so of the webinar. To feel free to use the Q&A feature to get your questions submitted. We'll be addressing those questions shortly. And as we look to conclude our prepared remarks, I'd like to just lean on Alexander once more here. As we've seen, goods classifications is a major part of the HS code schema, but in your opinion, is this change looking at the problem from the wrong angle? And, in other words, should the focus on dual use items be from the non-standardized goods descriptions that are used when describing the goods? Or, in applying uniformity and mandating the use of appropriate HS codes?
So, Mike, it seems to me this is a kind of a progressive evolution of the HS code structure and the approach, right? So what I took away from Byron's remarks from again, practical sort of finance and transactional perspective is the power of the ability to triangulate this information. So we're able to look at this at the macro level, look at the spikes, identify some deltas that are look a little bit strange in terms of the broader pool of activity, and then determine where there might be a problem requiring further analysis. And I would kind of look at that as a top-down approach. And then when you marry that with the problem that financial institutions and other trade players are having going bottom up, in other words, looking at a single shipment or a single set of product and trying to figure out, okay, is the pricing here that we're able to determine on this shipment within a reasonable range or not? If we can triangulate that with this kind of top-down macro analysis that's facilitated with this structure, I think that's extremely powerful. So, again, not to be too finance-oriented, but just to give you a sense, trade finance banks are being asked to do price validation. And their argument to the regulators is, hang on a minute, we are not commodity trade experts. We have a certain type of expertise, but we may not know whether a $10,000 handbag is an appropriate price or not. Anybody can identify a $10,000 banana as a problem, but the $10,000 handbag is not quite as obvious, right? So where's the reasonableness check in terms of how much a financial institution can engage in this? So I think what Byron laid out for us is a very compelling case for the power of data, the power of the development of the HS code structure, and the ability to use multiple sources to triangulate to some kind of reasonable conclusion. And then I think the final point I'd like to leave the audience with, and that's a good takeaway for me, is kind of highlighting again the growing sense of responsibility of buyers in particular for the broad conduct of their entire supply chain. So whether you're talking sustainability, whether you're talking financial crime, whether you're talking about liquidity and financing, all of these components are increasingly central to the buyer that sits at the hub of these supply chains. And so the HS code data and the evolution of the structure of the HS code system, I think, is an extremely compelling tool in the tool set for not only the financiers and the risk assessors, but also the buyers and those actually transacting in the trade flows.
Good stuff. Thanks, Alexander. Yeah, and I mean, all setting our clocks to 5 years forward when we get another revision, and maybe we'll be talking about the same topics then. So good stuff. Well, I know we're close to time. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for your prepared remarks. Russell, Byron, Alexander, certainly a wealth of experience in helping us all to familiarize ourselves with some important areas of the revision that we can expect in just a few short weeks on January 1. This time, I'd like to remind everyone about the presence of the Q&A feature within the webinar. We'll be getting to those questions very shortly. feel free to take a moment to submit a question for the panel if you'd like to do so. We look forward to selecting a number of those questions here as time allows. Also, please remember that there's a survey option for you to submit feedback about this webinar. Your comments are very important to us and help to optimize the topics and formats that we present that's relevant to our audiences. And we'll progress to the Q&A feature at this time. So trying to just kind of start at the beginning, maybe over to Russell for a few of these here. There's some comments actually from fairly early on in the webinar. One was that the 77 chapter 77 that you referenced as kind of that catch-all for future technological innovations was subsequent to transposition from CCCN to the HS structure in the 1980s. So obviously, we have some attendees that have probably worked in this classification scheme for a very long time. Very interesting to see that comment there. But there's also a few comments and questions about just the, if I'm a user, where do I go to find these resources, right? So how can I get an updated PDF file on the changes in HS codes? And so maybe worthy of answering it, in the context of IHS Markit clients, where we post some of those resources in our subscription tools, and maybe the WCO website for everyone else.
Absolutely, yeah. So there will definitely going to be available within the documentation area of the existing IHS Markit products where this would be appropriate. So we'll have those available for you. Specifically looking at the correlation between the 2017 and the 2022 changes, so that you can see which of your particular codes are affected. Additionally, if you don't want to wait on us, if they're not already available up on the website within IHS Markit, you can also go out to the World Customs Organization. There's an entire section. I think we may have tried to highlight it earlier, where you can see the information around that same correlation, to be able to pull that down, to be able to kind of see which of your codes are affected and how they're being affected with this revision.
Okay, interesting. Thanks for that. And Byron, maybe one for you. I have a question here about, what are the possibilities of using HS codes throughout trade documents and making it compulsory? Any thoughts about that? I think that might be probably kind of a broad question, but maybe that's the holy grail. But any comments on how how reasonable that might be to actually see in practice?
Yeah, I guess, as you say, it is the holy grail, right? Which probably means it's never going to happen. I think, extremely unlikely. People kind of talk about it from time to time because it would be good to have it, because it would allow you to be able to, manage goods on documentation a lot easier. It would allow people in the various industries who we're talking to today on the audience to be able to manage those goods as best as they need as well, to be able to, analyze them, put those goods into the right segments, work out what the right tariffs are, the export controls which are in place for those goods as well. But yeah, the general kind of fragmented nature of trade finance and documentation around it means that it's very unlikely. And it's one of those kind of age-old questions where, pretty much like the IMO for a ship as well, right? Which is another piece of information and piece of data which, would have the same kind of benefits in other areas. But it's very unlikely. I think at the moment, the way in which the WCO has managed the 2022 changes is probably the best way to go, because it does it from a different angle. It is top down, and I think it will work out better that way. And I think we're likely to see the extension of these ECCN codes in this way as well, which will kind of works out a lot better. Mapping the ECCN into the HS code will have a lot more impact on other people as well. And I think it's the one which is more likely to kind of take off in that way. Rather than the other way around, which is using HS codes around, goods descriptions and, being a more general part of, trade finance.
And Alexander, any other comments to add there?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, I would on this point just add one commercial observation, which is while you may not be able to mandate the use of these codes and it might be difficult to reach that holy grail, one practical way it might work is if the buyers and sellers themselves agree, either in the sales contract or in the letter of credit, for example. That's one of the data elements that the exporter must provide in one or more of those documents. So at the commercial level, it's not that big a stretch to start to bring that into practice. And so while that may not get us to the holy grail of having it used across the board, some of these traditional instruments still account for about 10% or $2 trillion in trade flows annually. So it will create some level of critical mass if the buyers and sellers make that part of their commercial practice.
Thanks for that, Alexander. And just an acknowledgement to the audience. I know that we're over time. We do our best to keep this within the allotted time, but I see a large number of attendees. So just to try to wrap up here, a few final links here representing a few ways to keep in touch with IHS Markit's numerous webinars, events, publications, solutions. We're pretty excited at the revival of in-person events, starting with the TPM conference in Long Beach at the end of February, our flagship annual conference with a full week of thought leadership, networking opportunities, much more. This year, we're introducing the TPM Tech leading up to the event, focusing specifically on tech trends impacting shippers and support the support periphery. You won't want to miss that one. As a reminder, today's webinar is replayable using the same link that you used to attend the session. And in closing, on behalf of all of today's panelists, I would like to thank you all very much for your participation. Once again, we hope that you found it very thought-provoking, insightful, and action-oriented. We wish everyone a great holiday season ahead, and we hope you will join us again in future sessions. Take care, everyone. Be well.